Her father abandoned her and her mother. Years later, she became famous and received a phone call from him during a live interview. Dear viewers, welcome to our channel. Subscribe to receive more stories every day. Melanie stood alone in her small kitchen, staring at the TV screen where her daughter, Sophie, was being interviewed on one of the most watched talk shows in the country. Pride and anxiety warred in her chest as she took in the sight of Sophie, poised and confident, answering questions with the grace of a seasoned star. It was a moment Melanie had dreamed of for years, but one she hadn't fully prepared herself for. She knew the past was about to resurface, and the weight of secrets long buried was beginning to suffocate her. The host began with the typical lighthearted questions, asking Sophie about her rise to fame, her most challenging roles, and what it was like to be in the limelight. Sophie, radiant under the bright studio lights, charmed both the host and the audience with her easy smile and thoughtful responses. Watching from the kitchen, Melanie couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. She had raised Sophie on her own after her husband, Mark, had abandoned them. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every struggle, it had all led to this moment. But Melanie also knew what was coming. The host, known for digging into the personal lives of her guests, was circling the conversation towards something deeper. Melanie's heart clenched. She had worked so hard to protect Sophie from the painful truth of her father's disappearance, but now the world was about to hear Sophie's version of the story, one that didn't contain the whole truth. As Sophie laughed at the host's latest quip, Melanie's thoughts drifted back to that fateful night when Mark left. He had disappeared without warning, leaving nothing behind but a hastily scribbled note, vague and full of empty promises. Sophie had been just 5 years old, too young to fully understand the gravity of what had happened. Melanie had been thrust into a life of single motherhood with no support and no explanation. She had shielded Sophie from the truth as best as she could, providing her with a stable, loving home. But now, as Sophie sat under the spotlight, Melanie feared the cracks in her carefully constructed life were about to show. The host's tone shifted, and Melanie could feel the tension rising even from across the room. Sophie, the host said, leaning in slightly, you've spoken in the past about your close relationship with your mother. It's clear she's been a huge part of your journey to success. But what about your father? We've never heard you talk about him. Was he a part of your life growing up? Melanie's grip on the kitchen counter tightened. This was the moment she had dreaded. Sophie, ever composed, hesitated for a moment before responding. No, my father wasn't really in the picture, she said, her voice soft but steady. He left when I was very young. My mom didn't talk much about him, and I didn't ask. She was always enough for me. A pang of guilt shot through Melanie's heart. She had done her best to fill the void Mark had left, but she had also kept Sophie in the dark about the reasons behind his departure. It wasn't that she had lied. She had simply chosen to withhold the full story. Mark hadn't just left them. He had tried to come back. But Melanie, fearing for Sophie's well-being, had made the decision to keep him away. She had intercepted the letters, ignored the phone calls, and done everything in her power to protect her daughter from a man she believed was too unstable and dangerous to be a part of their lives. The host, sensing the emotional weight of Sophie's words, pressed further. That must have been difficult, growing up without a father. How did you cope with that? Sophie's expression softened as she answered. It wasn't easy, but my mom made sure I never felt like I was missing anything. She gave me all the love and support I needed, and I never felt like I needed more. Melanie's eyes welled with tears. She had worked tirelessly to ensure that Sophie never felt the absence of her father. But hearing Sophie speak those words made Melanie realize just how much her daughter had internalized the loss. No matter how hard she had tried, she couldn't erase the fact that Sophie had grown up without her father. And now, with the whole world watching, Sophie was admitting to the pain she had never fully expressed. The host nodded sympathetically. You're incredibly strong, Sophie. It's clear that your mother did an amazing job raising you. But have you ever thought about reconnecting with your father? Now that you're older and more established, do you think it's possible to rebuild a relationship with him? Melanie's heart raced. She had known this question was coming, but the reality of it was more terrifying than she had anticipated. Sophie hesitated again, her gaze distant as she considered the question. I've thought about it, she admitted, but I guess I've always felt like if he wanted to be a part of my life, he would have reached out. He made his choice, and I've made peace with that. Melanie felt a lump form in her throat. Mark had tried to reach out more than once, but she had made sure that he never got close. In her mind, she had been protecting Sophie from the chaos and instability that Mark had brought into their lives. But now, watching Sophie on TV, Melanie wondered if she had been wrong. Had she robbed her daughter of the chance to make her own decision about her father? Had her desire to protect Sophie caused more harm than good? The interview continued, but the damage had been done. Melanie couldn't shake the feeling that the past was creeping back into their lives, threatening to unravel everything she had worked so hard to build. Later that night, Melanie sat alone in the dimly lit living room, the remnants of Sophie's interview replaying in her mind. She had spent years shielding Sophie from the truth, but now she realized that the time had come to face it head-on. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, and when she picked it up, her heart sank. The message was from an unknown number, but the words sent a chill down her spine. "I saw the interview. We need to talk." Melanie's hands trembled as she read the message. She didn't need to guess who it was. After all these years, Mark had found them again. The following day, Melanie's anxiety only grew. She hadn't responded to Mark's message, but the weight of his sudden reappearance hung over her like a dark cloud. She had kept him out of their lives for so long. But now, with Sophie's fame thrusting their personal history into the public eye, Melanie feared that the truth she had buried for years was about to come out. By mid-afternoon, her phone rang again. Melanie stared at the screen, her heart pounding in her chest. It was Mark. With trembling hands, she answered the call. "What do you want, Mark?" There was a brief pause on the other end before he spoke. "I saw Sophie's interview. We need to talk about her." "There's nothing to talk about," Melanie replied, her voice tight with anger. "You walked out on us? You don't get to just show up now because you feel guilty." "I didn't leave by choice," Mark said, his voice heavy with regret. "You know that?" Melanie's breath caught in her throat. "Don't you dare try to rewrite history. You left us, Mark. I had to raise Sophie on my own. You didn't want to be a part of her life." Mark's voice softened. "I made mistakes. I know that. But I tried to come back, Melanie. You kept me away. You didn't give me a chance." Melanie's grip on the phone tightened. "I didn't let you back because I couldn't trust you. You were a mess, Mark. You would have destroyed us." There was a long pause on the other end before Mark spoke again. "I'm not that man anymore, Melanie. I've changed. Sophie deserves to know the truth." Melanie's heart raced. The truth. The truth was that she had kept Mark out of their lives because she had been terrified of what he might do to Sophie. But now, with Sophie all grown up and famous, could she still justify her decision? Was it still her place to protect Sophie from the truth? "I'll tell her when I'm ready," Melanie finally said, her voice shaking. "But it's going to come from me, not you." Before Mark could respond, Melanie hung up, her hand trembling as she set the phone down. She had spent years protecting Sophie, but now she realized that the truth was coming whether she was ready or not. After hanging up on Mark, Melanie sat frozen on the couch, her heart pounding. His words echoed in her mind. Sophie deserves to know the truth. Could he be right? After all these years, had she been wrong to keep him away from their daughter? The thought gnawed at her. But her memories of Mark's reckless behavior brought a flood of old fears back to the surface. He had been dangerous, unstable, a man who made promises he couldn't keep. Could she really allow him back into Sophie's life now? For the next few days, Melanie tried to focus on her work, but the tension between her and Sophie was palpable. Sophie had become distant after their conversation at the cafe, where Melanie had revealed that Mark had tried to come back, but she had kept him away. Sophie hadn't said much in response, but her silence spoke volumes. Melanie knew that her daughter needed time to process everything, but the longer Sophie stayed quiet, the more Melanie feared she had lost her trust forever. Melanie replayed their conversation over and over in her head. She had thought she was doing the right thing by keeping Mark out of their lives, protecting Sophie from the chaos he would have brought with him. But now, with Sophie an adult, Melanie wasn't sure she had made the right choice. She had kept so much from her daughter, and now the truth was unraveling faster than she could control. One evening, as Melanie sat in her living room, staring at the flickering television, her phone buzzed again. This time it was Sophie. "Mom, I've been thinking," Sophie's message read. "I need to talk to him. I need to hear his side." Melanie's heart sank. She had known this moment would come eventually, but it didn't make it any easier. She wanted to protect Sophie, but Sophie had a right to make her own decisions. She typed a reply, her hands shaking. "I understand. Just be careful." The next day, Sophie found herself sitting in a quiet corner of a small park, waiting for the man who was her father, but felt like a stranger. She had grown up with a version of Mark that was crafted from silence and absence, and now she was about to meet the real man behind the stories her mother had told. Sophie's mind raced as she waited, her emotions a whirlwind of anger, curiosity, and confusion. When Mark finally arrived, Sophie could hardly recognize him. The man walking toward her looked older, his face weathered by time and regret. His once vibrant energy was replaced by a heavy weariness. As he approached, he offered a tentative smile, but Sophie couldn't bring herself to return it. "Hi, Sophie," Mark said, his voice hesitant, as though he wasn't sure if he had the right to say her name. Sophie nodded but remained silent, waiting for him to speak first. She wasn't sure what she expected from this meeting, but she knew she needed answers. Mark sat down across from her, his hands fidgeting as he struggled to find the right words. I don't know where to start," he admitted, his voice filled with guilt. "I've thought about this moment for so long, but now that I'm here, I don't know what to say." Sophie stared at him, her arms crossed over her chest. "Why did you leave?" she asked, cutting straight to the heart of the matter. Mark looked down at his hands, shame flickering across his face. "It's complicated, Sophie. Your mom probably told you some of it, but there's more to the story." Sophie's heart raced. "More? Like what?" Mark took a deep breath, his voice heavy with regret. "I was in a bad place back then. I made a lot of mistakes. When I left, it wasn't because I didn't care about you. I was involved with dangerous people. People who could have hurt you and your mom. I thought leaving was the only way to keep you safe." Sophie frowned, her mind struggling to process his words. "What are you talking about?" Mark's eyes darted around the park, as though he was afraid someone might overhear. "I owed money to people I shouldn't have gotten involved with. I was in deep trouble, and if I had stayed, they could have come after you. I didn't want to drag you and your mom into my mess, so I left. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I thought it was the only way to protect you." Sophie's anger flared. "You could have stayed and gotten help. You didn't have to leave." Mark's face crumpled with guilt. "I know. I was weak. I made the wrong choice, and I've regretted it every day since. But I tried to come back. Your mom, she wouldn't let me." Sophie's mind reeled as she processed his words. Her mother had kept Mark away, and she had done it to protect her. But now Sophie wasn't sure who to believe. Was her mother wrong to block him out? Or was Mark just trying to make excuses for his mistakes? "She kept you away because she thought you were a danger to us," Sophie said, her voice trembling with emotion. "She was trying to protect me." "I know," Mark said softly, "and I don't blame her for that. I made a lot of mistakes, but I've changed, Sophie. I'm not that man anymore. I've cleaned up my life, and I want to be a part of yours if you'll let me." Sophie stared at him, unsure of what to feel. The man in front of her was both her father and a stranger. Her entire life had been shaped by his absence, and now, here he was asking for a second chance. Could she trust him? Could she forgive him? "I don't know," Sophie whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't know if I can forgive you for what you did." Mark's face fell, but he didn't push. "I understand. I just wanted you to know the truth. You deserve to know why I left. And if you ever want to talk, I'm here." That night, Sophie returned to her apartment, her mind still swirling with everything Mark had told her. She sat on the couch, staring at her phone, unsure of what to do next. Part of her wanted to call her mother and confront her about what Mark had said, but another part of her wasn't ready for that conversation. The pain was still too raw. As she scrolled through her phone, a message popped up from her mother. It was short but filled with emotion. "I love you, Sophie. No matter what happens, I hope you understand that everything I did was to protect you." Tears filled Sophie's eyes as she read the message. She knew her mother had always acted out of love, but now, everything felt so much more complicated. Melanie had kept Mark away, believing it was the right thing to do. But had she robbed Sophie of the chance to make her own decision about her father? Sophie set her phone down and leaned back on the couch, her mind racing. Her mother had been her rock her entire life, but now, Sophie wasn't sure who she could trust. Mark's story was filled with regret and excuses, but there was a kernel of truth to it. He had been trying to protect them in his own twisted way. And Melanie, she had been trying to protect Sophie too, but at what cost? Sophie wiped away her tears, feeling a sense of loss she hadn't expected. The image of her perfect family, even if it was just her and her mother, had been shattered. Now, she was left with the pieces, unsure of how to put them back together. As she sat in the darkness of her apartment, Sophie realized that the truth wasn't as simple as she had once believed. Both of her parents had made choices that affected her life in ways she was only now beginning to understand. And now, it was up to her to decide what to do with that truth. In the days following her meeting with Mark, Sophie struggled to make sense of everything. Her mind kept replaying their conversation in the park, and each time, the story felt more complicated. Mark had abandoned her and her mother, but now he claimed it was to protect them. He had made terrible choices, but had he really left for their safety? Or was it just another excuse? And then there was her mother, Melanie, who had kept Mark away for years, believing that protecting Sophie from the truth was the best course of action. Sophie's heart ached with the weight of their conflicting stories, and she didn't know whom to trust. As Sophie sat in her apartment one evening, staring at her phone, the silence around her felt suffocating. She had always thought she knew the full story of her life, but now she realized that her world had been built on secrets and half-truths. Both of her parents had made decisions that had shaped her childhood, and now that she was an adult, she had to face the consequences of those choices. Her phone buzzed, breaking her from her thoughts. It was her mother. Melanie had been trying to reach out ever since Sophie had met with Mark, but Sophie hadn't been ready to talk. She needed space to figure things out, to come to terms with everything she had learned. But now, staring at the message on her phone, Sophie knew it was time. She couldn't avoid this conversation any longer. She opened the message. "I know you've been through a lot, Sophie. When you're ready, we need to talk. I love you no matter what." Tears welled in Sophie's eyes as she read her mother's words. Melanie had always been there for her, always put Sophie's needs first. But now, Sophie questioned whether her mother had done the right thing by keeping Mark out of their lives. She had been trying to protect Sophie, but in doing so, had she robbed her of the chance to know her father? Sophie's emotions were tangled, a mixture of love, anger, and confusion. Taking a deep breath, Sophie typed a response. "Mom, we need to talk. I'll come by tomorrow." The next afternoon, Sophie arrived at her mother's house, her heart heavy with anticipation. The familiar sight of the modest home, where she had spent her entire childhood, brought a flood of memories rushing back. Sophie had always felt safe here, under her mother's protective wing. But now, everything felt different. Melanie greeted her at the door, her face filled with both relief and apprehension. It was clear that she had been waiting for this moment, but like Sophie, she wasn't sure how the conversation would unfold. They sat down in the living room, the atmosphere tense and thick with unspoken emotions. Melanie was the first to break the silence. "Sophie, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I know I've hurt you by keeping things from you. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I see now that I should have been honest with you." Sophie looked at her mother, the woman who had raised her with love and devotion, and for the first time, she saw the vulnerability in her eyes. Melanie had always seemed so strong, so sure of herself. But now, she looked like a woman who had been carrying a heavy burden for far too long. "You were trying to protect me," Sophie said softly, her voice filled with conflicting emotions. "I know that, but it doesn't change the fact that you kept my father away from me. I didn't even know he tried to come back." Melanie nodded, her eyes filled with guilt. "I know, and I'm sorry. I thought I was doing the right thing. Your father, he wasn't stable back then. He was involved in dangerous things, and I couldn't risk him bringing that into your life. I didn't want him to hurt you the way he hurt me." Sophie's heart ached as she listened to her mother's words. Melanie had been trying to shield her from the pain and chaos that Mark had brought into their lives. But in doing so, she had made a decision that had affected Sophie's entire life. Now, Sophie wasn't sure if she could ever fully forgive her. "Mom, I met with him," Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I needed to hear his side of the story." Melanie's face paled, her eyes widening with fear. "You met with him?" Sophie nodded. "He told me why he left. He said it was to protect us, that he was involved with dangerous people and didn't want them to hurt us." Melanie's hands trembled as she listened, her worst fears coming true. "Sophie, your father, he made terrible choices. He put us in danger, whether he meant to or not. I kept him away because I didn't want him to hurt you. I did it out of love, but I see now that I should have let you decide for yourself." Sophie's throat tightened with emotion. She could see the pain in her mother's eyes, the regret that weighed on her. But the damage had already been done. Sophie had grown up without a father, and now, as an adult, she was left to navigate the complicated web of lies and truths that had shaped her life. "I don't know what to think anymore," Sophie said, tears streaming down her face. "He says he's changed, that he wants to be part of my life. But I don't know if I can trust him, and I don't know if I can trust you either." Melanie's heart broke as she listened to her daughter's words. "I know I've lost your trust, and I'm so sorry. But I need you to know that everything I did was because I love you. I was trying to protect you from the pain I went through with your father. But I realize now that I should have been honest with you." The silence between them was heavy, both women grappling with the weight of their shared past. Sophie's anger and confusion boiled over. But beneath it all, she knew that her mother had always acted out of love. even if her choices had been flawed. "I need time," Sophie said finally, her voice shaking. "I need time to figure out how I feel about all of this." Melanie nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "Take all the time you need, Sophie. I'll be here whenever you're ready." In the weeks that followed, Sophie struggled to come to terms with everything she had learned. Her relationship with both her parents felt fragile, like a delicate thread that could snap at any moment. She wanted to believe that Mark had changed, that he was no longer the man who had abandoned her. But the scars of his absence ran deep, and trust was not something that could be rebuilt overnight. Her relationship with her mother was equally strained. Melanie had always been her rock, the one person Sophie could rely on. But now, knowing that her mother had kept such a monumental secret from her, Sophie wasn't sure if their bond could ever fully recover. One evening, as Sophie sat in her apartment, her phone rang. It was Mark. Her heart raced as she stared at the screen, unsure of whether she should answer. After a moment, she took a deep breath and picked up the call. "Sophie." Mark's voice was tentative, filled with hope and uncertainty. "Hi, Dad," Sophie said softly, the word feeling foreign on her lips. There was a long pause on the other end before Mark spoke again. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for everything. I know I can't undo the past, but I want to try to make things right." Sophie's eyes filled with tears as she listened to his words. "I don't know if things will ever be right," she said honestly, "but I'm willing to try." As Sophie began to rebuild her relationships with both her parents, she realized that the truth was messy and complicated. There were no easy answers, no clear paths forward. But she knew that healing would take time, and she was willing to take that journey, one step at a time. Dear viewers, thank you for watching. If you like this story, please subscribe to our channel to receive more stories every day. Share with us what you think of this story.